You're listening to The Alchemist's Ring, audiobook performed by author Jason Lee Willis. This is Part 4, The Lion Den of Emperor Aurangzeb. Chapter 62, Kensington Palace, 1706. Sir Isaac Newton shivered, but not just from the cold. He was afraid. Too many unknown variables. How have I bungled things so badly? Catherine Barton, his niece, seemed oblivious to the peril that waited for him. She leaned forward and kissed him on the cheek. "You'll be fine." The carriage door opened, and he flinched at the sight of two royal guards outside the doorway. He stepped out into the cold and into the palace. Angels closed the mouths of the lions to save Daniel, Newton reflected as he followed the Queen's guard through the ornate halls. I must deliver myself from this peril. He steadied his breathing and reviewed the rules of protocol for his meeting with Queen Anne. One misstep, and the lions would tear his flesh from the bones. Studying came naturally for Newton, but social customs were a science very foreign to him. While he'd met her several times in recent years, he'd never met her alone and in private. A royal meeting did exactly what it was meant to do: terrify him. Queen Anne rested upon a sofa like a walrus upon a melting chunk of ice. It surprised him to see how much weight she'd gained in only the several months since he'd last seen her at his knighting ceremony. Her blue and gold gowns had ballooned, and her double chin rolled over her pearls. Her dark hair had been replaced by a golden wig, and her pale skin contrasted with the rouge upon her cheeks and lips. Her fingers were swollen from gout, which is why she lounged upon soft velvet. Although Queen Anne's appetite was legendary, she was not the lion Newton feared. In a chair beside the Queen, her royal husband, Prince George of Denmark, looked almost dainty in comparison. As consort to the Queen, and not an acting king, he'd been given the title of Duke of Cumberland and the title of Lord High Admiral. It is not as husband, prince, or duke that he will devour me. In another chair, on the opposite side of the couch, the lion sat with crossed arms. George Churchill, while not as obese as the Queen, still filled his velvet chair, which matched the burgundy velvets he wore. As a longtime friend of the royal couple, Churchill had been granted the title of Admiral of the Blue, giving him command of the royal fleet. Newton heard whispers about the two Georges, as well as Queen Anne's own relationships, but he understood the three heads were tines of the same trident. Newton passed the first test with flying colors, and after being introduced by the title given to him by Queen Anne, he sat in the chair across from the triumvirate. Like any great apex predator, they lured their prey to them with flattery. "Is that the new medal design?" Queen Anne asked. "I'm still the master of the mint, aren't I? Surely this can't be the purpose of the meeting." "Freshly minted, Your Majesty. Would you like to inspect its craftsmanship?" With a nod, Prince George rose and carried the leather box to his wife, who politely raised eyes and even guffawed when she saw her likeness. "Thanks to the craftsmanship of your mint, Sir Newton, my likeness will be preserved by history rather than by reality." Prince George remained standing, and then in rehearsed orchestration, she handed it back to her husband, who then passed in front of the couch to hand it to the Admiral of the Blue. Once accepted, Queen Anne continued, "Your work will be presented to a fellow Whig, Captain John Norris. Georgie, remind Sir Newton why we've decided to knight Captain Norris." Why are they belittling me? Captain Norris is single-handedly winning the War of Spanish Succession for the Protestant nations, Prince George explained. Perhaps the Admiral of the Blue can better explain it. Yes, the other George continued. Captain Norris commanded the vanguard in the Battle of Malaga, and most recently showed cunning and valor at the capture of Barcelona. What does any of this have to do with me? Norris knows nothing of Madagascar. There you are, Queen Anne ended the summary. As we did with you, we chose to knight a prominent Whig whose public exploits are openly celebrated. The scientific community knew your name, even if the Tory politicians fail to understand how beneficial your time at the Mint has been for us. Captain Norris earned his knighthood for his naval exploits and for his ambition. Newton found himself reflecting on the play Macbeth. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. Perhaps my sins have not been discovered. Newton kept his mouth shut and smiled. But the longer their smiles lingered, the more he knew they were playing with him. Finally, Admiral George flinched. We recently hosted Captain Norris, and your name was brought up on 2 separate occasions. Yes, Newton conceded. I first learned of John Norris when he was known as Foul-Weather Jack during the War of the Grand Alliance, when he was tasked with harassing the French in Hudson Bay. He was a friend of a friend who provided victories, both great and small, that helped bring France to the negotiation table to end that war. It was your shared friendship that turned our conversation in an unexpected direction, Prince George teased with raised eyebrows. Newton remained calm. Yes, I have many friends in many fields, which is how I was able to bring financial stability to the kingdom. Captain Norris explained that he frequently received correspondence from you through a certain William Kidd. We executed Kidd for piracy, Queen Anne added. I labeled him as a pirate, and now that is being used against me. My friendship was with Governor Bellamont of the Massachusetts colony, who not only recommended Kidd, but later helped secure his arrest when he exceeded the mandate given to him by King William, your predecessor and brother-in-law. I did not utilize the services of men outside the Royal Navy to relay messages, conduct business, and gather valuable intelligence. Newton opened his eyes widely as if expecting a specific chemical reaction to occur, even though he had no idea where it was about to go. Too many variables, too many unknowns. It could be inferred that you helped direct Captain Norris to attack French outposts in Hudson Bay, Prince George asserted. I thwarted an EOS plot. I wish I could take credit for such an endeavor. Securing outposts in Hudson Bay has given England a foothold in acquiring the vast resources of Canada. If we could not go through the Great Lakes, we had to find a way around, Newton remembered from studying the maps. Taking Hudson Bay and then Lake Winnipeg offered a backdoor solution from the north. Is this conversation leading to my failed gamble with LeSueur? Prince George continued. Foul-Weather Jack certainly did make a name for himself during the 9 Years' War, and before we could knight him, we needed to understand an accusation of insubordination, where he received orders to retake Newfoundland and Labrador. Such an action certainly would have weakened the Sun King's hold on New France, Newton assessed, knowing he'd given the order that would have caused chaos and rekindling the war prior to peace treaties. How are they on to LeSueur? Did Kidd confess prior to his execution, or 2 separate occasions? What don't I know? Let me be clear, Admiral George began. Captain Norris believes you were orchestrating foreign policy from the Tower of London at a time when you were only Warden of the Mint. Is this true? Absolutely. Newton grabbed hold of the lion's mane instead of running in terror. The financial networks for the Kingdom of England are vast, and corruption ran wild for decades. I made inquiries into bankers, investors, governors, royal houses, anywhere I suspected corruption, and I utilized the resources given to me. During periods of war, corruption often goes unchecked. For me to investigate accusations, I could not afford to do it through official channels, and I was forced to use spurious resources, such as men of notorious character like Captain Kidd. Considering the reputation of Captain Kidd, I cannot imagine what he might have said in my name to Captain Norris. And luckily for me, Captain Kidd cannot answer these questions. Queen Anne pursed her lips, looked at the 2 Georges, and sighed. I've been told, besides being a world-class scientist, that you are a religious scholar as well. That is true. My stepfather was a reverend, and in order for us to converse, I had to learn his language. Prior to my commission at the Mint, I had an obsession with antiquity and prophecy. You must be aware of Christ's parable about a house divided, a metaphor he used when talking about the house of darkness. Yes, I am familiar with it. We've called you here today because England is just a few decades removed from a civil war that almost caused the empire to collapse from within. I wish to continue the work begun by my sister and brother-in-law, William and Mary. Even now, my Anglican Tories fight against Protestant Whigs, while my half-brother, the Old Pretender, rallies his Catholic support against us. Along with the chaos of religious strife, I seek to bring Ireland and Scotland into a union that will unite us as Great Britain. While juggling these domestic threats, England is participating in the War of Spanish Succession, which will either elevate or destroy England as a global empire. To survive the days to come, we risk financial ruin, and I learn that my master of the Mint is funneling funds to support a fleet of pirates? Explain yourself. Ha ha ha. There it is. I am a servant of England, acting under orders from King William, Newton began, knowing what he held in his jacket pocket. I am the left hand belonging to one body, the body of England. I can assure you that the management of funds during this time of war is beyond reproach, and personal funds afforded to my office have been made through legal grants belonging to men upon whose shoulders unite the crown and the right arm of the military. We are a house united, even if the right hand does not always know what the left hand is doing. A vague confession without any details. Let's have them reveal what they know. So Captain Norris spoke true, Prince George asked. I am not aware of Captain Norris's claims, but I am certain my actions I have taken promote only the welfare of England, and not any personal projects. Our concerns go far beyond accusations with the notorious Captain Kidd, Admiral George began. There are rumors from the Indian Ocean far more troubling. Rumors from a traitor? Could it be Bellamont? Now I must rewrite history. Yes, rumors have been whispered in my ear as well about a terrible disaster near Madagascar. I believe it is called a tsunami in that region, a giant wave created from an earthquake deep in the ocean. I heard the great storm of 1703 paled in comparison to what this storm did to the coastal villages on the eastern shore. A storm? Prince George's brow wrinkled. A giant wave. They know about the Black Fleet, but its destruction has not been factually established. I will decide the facts and let them deal with the rumors. Yes, a British merchant ship traveling from Bombay passed by Madagascar shortly after it happened, describing the devastation caused by the earthquake. We heard of another disaster, Admiral George added, showing frustration. Escort ships in the northern Indian Ocean encountered a surviving vessel from a private fleet. Although it was affirmed this was not a typical pirate ship, its only identification was a black flag with crossed thigh bones. Yes, our missing ship has been found. May I present you with my commission, instructions given to me by both of our predecessors. Prince George snatched the letters from his hand. He walked it over to Queen Anne, who began to read it. Thomas Neal was your predecessor at the Mint. Who is this Robert Boyle fellow who signed next to King William? Robert Boyle was the left hand for King William, a gifted scientist, a devout Anglican, and leader of an organization he dubbed the Invisible College. Yes, I see mention of the Invisible College in the letter, Queen Anne explained. Explain it. Upon Robert Boyle's death, I assumed control of his commission. And in the second letter, you will see that King William directed me to deal with the coalition of pirates gathered in the Indian Ocean. As Captain Norris correctly assessed, I did enlist Captain Kidd and other ambitious men to deal with this shadowy threat in Madagascar. And my financial supporters, understanding how Indian Ocean piracy threatened commerce, funded the creation of this covert fleet. During the commission of its duties, however, this great tidal wave brought ruin to both sides. The fleeing ship you spoke of has more likely than not turned rogue, or else it would have remained in Madagascar for subsequent orders. Does this satisfy your majesty? A few sheets of paper have closed the mouths of these lions. But which of my 8 captains fled Madagascar? I'll have the traitor's head on my desk. Queen Anne handed the letters back to her husband, who then walked them over to Newton. A small bell summoned the footman to return to the room. Sir Newton, from this time forward, please keep the Royal Navy in the loop with such grand endeavors. Newton bowed. Yes, Your Majesty. As Newton walked out of the lion's den, he smiled. The great fat fools thought they could eat me. Now I've ensnared their support and learned a valuable truth. A ship fled. Once outside, back in the cold, he almost began trotting back to the waiting carriage. When the door opened, Catherine scowled. It's about time. How did it go? It took them 15 years, but I think they finally understand I am more than a scientist. They knew I arranged for Captain Norris to take Hudson Bay, but had no imagination for the reasons I did it. They also knew about the Black Fleet, but had no idea what to say when I effectively sank it with a lie about a tsunami. Catherine chuckled. My clever uncle. So you're not going to be arrested and thrown into your own tower? No, but I have a task for you, my sweet. Find out which of our 8 captains has been spying for the crown this whole time. An excuse for more parties, Catherine smiled. I'll deliver his head upon a plate, dear uncle. Chapter 63, Natchez, Mississippi River, 1706. 200 miles upstream from the mouth of the Mississippi, Gaspar continued his mission, blindly unaware of anything that took place in the Indian Ocean. What have we caught in our nets today? In the distance, he could hear the excited voices of his Natchez soldiers, who were mostly teenage boys given to him for seasoning. Gaspar worked beside the young men in the trap he fashioned, and his post was at the center of it all in the big cypress tree. The trap was set at 2 islands opposite of a large meander that had almost filled in. Deep in the meander, the scouts made camp, but here, along the river, the scouts hid in the trees overlooking the 2 islands that divided the river. "Sir, we've caught a Frenchman," a Natchez warrior said with a wide grin. Gaspar didn't want to have to climb all the way down from his perchy loft. "A fur trader?" "Yes, but he didn't come from the south like the others," the young warrior stated. "He came from the north." Before Gaspar could even press further, another young man came running up to the base of the tree. "We were going to kill him, but he recognized the word you'd given us." "Pennicott." "Go back and make sure he isn't harmed," Gaspar said. A moment later, he found himself breathing heavily at the base of the big cypress tree. Except for getting to know his new Natchez allies, Gaspar had served the periphery for almost a year without any news. 6 years after LeSueur left Pennicott behind at Fort LaHoulier, far upstream, the secret agent of the periphery finally came down the river. By the time Gaspar reached the prisoner, a dozen Natchez warriors surrounded the ragged Frenchman, who looked at him with curious but doubtful eyes. His European clothes were in tatters, patched and replaced by furs and leathers. Despite a ragged beard, the young man looked relatively healthy. Gaspar, however, had to let his heart and lungs calm. "You're not from around here, are you?" Pennicott said. 30 years earlier, the periphery had sent a spy to the Mississippi in search of allies. The Natchez had accepted the news, hoping to survive the coming colonial tide. LeSueur had almost murdered the spy, believing him an enemy. "Dubois," Gaspar said, invoking the name of the elder periphery spy who'd cultivated Natchez relations before returning to Europe. Pennicott nodded and then collapsed in relief. "Philip fucking Dubois," he repeated the keyword to identify himself as the lost periphery agent described by LeSueur. Gaspar quickly explained the situation to the Natchez, and he embraced the stranger. 2 men to hold back an entire nation, Gaspar realized. But it's more help than I had when I woke up this morning. Soon, Eos and France would send more than just a few squads into the net. I can only hope I last until Guerin and LeSueur return. Chapter 64, Ormond House, London, 1706. Across the street, the elm trees budded, filling the branches with a tinge of green. The marketplace already bloomed with tulips and spring grass. My enemies move while I stand still, watching days, weeks, and months slip by. Remembering pieces of a late-night conversation, Newton turned back to his bed, straightened the sheets, and pulling the red mohair blanket back into place. His old friend, the mohair blanket, kept him warm through another cold London winter, but with the arrival of spring, he'd pushed it down to his ankles before dawn. After declaring crimson as his favorite color to his niece, every fabric he now owned seemed to be crimson, from his bedspread to his curtains to his chair. Most of the jackets in his closet were crimson, but today he slipped on a heavy blue robe and slippers. Since he'd transitioned from science to politics, she'd been his most trusted aide. Walking down the stairs to his office and library, he found his coffee and newspapers waiting on a small table beside his crimson sofa. Memories of the late night kept him from sitting down, and he continued to the staircase that led to the main floor. There in the kitchen, he found Bernard Clairval hunched over a plate of bacon and eggs. He asked, "Yes?" "Catherine has an answer," Newton said. "Gather everything, including maps, and bring them upstairs to the library." "Good. This sedentary life bores me," Bernard said with a crooked grin. Beyond the kitchen, the spacious entertaining room remained pristine except for articles of clothing leading to the small apartment on the far side. He'd given Catherine 6 hours to sleep and for the alcohol coursing through her system to filter. Her body sprawled out on the bed, with just a thin gown covering her form. He sat at a small footstool beside her bed. "Catherine, my mind has been spinning for hours while you sleep. It's time to get dressed and join me upstairs in the library to discuss your discoveries." Catherine groaned as if dying and opened one eye. "I was dreaming of tatty scones." "Considering the hour, you might want to fancy something for lunch. Can you mix a concoction for my headache, dearest uncle? Take your time. We'll be sorting through things upstairs." 33 minutes later, Catherine walked into the room, perfumed, powdered, combed, and dressed to the dazzle. Newton extended the cup, which she snatched as she walked by. She perched down in the love seat opposite of his reading chair. Bernard sat in a corner of the crimson sofa. She finished her beverage to the last drop as she continued her habit of letting the men in her life spill their secrets. Finally, she asked, "So what in the world does Balachi mean?" Bernard leaned back on the couch, crossing his arms and kicking up his feet. "The hunchback knows, but I'm being kept in the dark?" Catherine asked sternly. "Go ahead and tell her," Bernard said. "I thought the whole point was to keep the two of you separate from one another," Newton argued. "My right hand and my left hand, so to speak." Bernard rolled his eyes. "She's shown discretion since we invited her to London. You served, without question, for several years before Gnosis was given to you. As far as I'm concerned, Miss Barton should know more. I almost lost my mind when I learned the truth, but keeping secrets from her will only endanger our relationship. How could I bear losing her? Tell me about our songbird, and I'll tell you all about Balachi." "An abusive office," Catherine began. "Not as the master of the mint. They are more than delighted with your financial work, but they've known for quite a while that you're the president of the invisible college, as you put it." "How much do they know?" Bernard asked. "If this was a Catholic monarchy, you might need to worry," Catherine said, fiddling with her fingernails. "But they seem to view it as a scientific club, even if they don't have a name or clear understanding. It is Admiral Churchill who wanted your blood, especially when he found out resources for warships were not going to him during the War of Spanish Succession." "How long have they known?" Newton asked. "Since you ordered the fleet built shortly after the attack of the Ganges Sawai. They were willing to look the other way when you hired privateers like Kidd to do your bidding. But creating the Black Fleet crossed the line. Luckily, your handling of Kidd's trial proved enough to them. In a way, both of you were on trial, and luckily, Kidd hung instead of you. I am the public face for a private enclave. Now I understand why. I am expendable." "So did they court one of my captains, or was he one of them from the beginning?" "Double agent, apparently," Catherine added. "Like you, the Crown wanted an ambitious young man willing to get his hands dirty to advance his position. Edward Drummond." Newton turned to watch Bernard's reaction, whose face twisted until he realized he was being watched. "What?" he snapped. "He was the only one who could positively identify Henry Avery." My calculated risk failed. "And that fact is what he used against us. I take it our Scottish Queen got a hold of him before we made our move?" The royal investigators wanted to know as much as they could about Henry Avery, so when Drummond returned to England, he was quickly caught up into the conspiracy to spy on you. Again, both Georges took offense at the creation of the Black Fleet and wanted to find ways to entrap you. "A complete naval disaster should have given it to them," Newton said. "I doubt if I'll be given another opportunity to spend such vast sums of money." Yes. Luckily, Edward Drummond's true loyalty did not belong to Queen Anne. What do you know of the Order of Eos? Bernard grinned. "See, I told you she is too clever for us. Your brains might have 10 times the information in it, but she is quick-witted and clever." "I take it you old men already know something about the Order of Eos?" Both nodded. "It will explain Balachi," Newton said. "But please continue." "Edward Drummond had sworn loyalty to the Order of Eos before he left his home in the Caribbean, and as an agent of Eos, he collected information while working his way up the ranks, until the day he and Henry Avery mutinied. And Drummond had a card to play, selling information to the highest bidder, which would have been me if I hadn't brought financial stability to the English crown. When you were summoned to the meeting at Kensington Palace, they already knew all about the Black Fleet. But then suddenly, nothing. Drummond vanished." "He is quite adept at double-crossing," Newton added. "At least I picked an impressive young man, even if he is my enemy. Now Queen Anne and her Georges want what they paid for, and the main branch of the Drummond family are distancing themselves from him," Catherine said. Her lovely gaze fell upon Bernard just as it did for her social victims. The misshapen creature, once deposited on the slopes of Mount Grospitz as a form of post-birth abortion, nervously adjusted his position on the love seat. "If I were to ask where Edward Drummond took his warship, I'm assuming the answer will involve Balachi?" Newton glanced to Bernard. "Yes, before explaining Balachi, I'd like Bernard to tell you what happened on Madagascar." "Long before you were born," Bernard said, looking down, "there was an alliance of men seeking the truth. When the alliance had run its course, one side betrayed another. Along with the philosophical betrayal, thievery was involved, and the stolen goods were shifted from stronghold to stronghold until they ended up in Madagascar." "Yes. The previous Grand Shepherds focused mostly on maintaining power within the courts of Europe, but your uncle is determined to recover what was lost so long ago." "Under the guise of hunting pirates?" "Oh no, the pirates and thieves are one and the same, even if they are unaware of their own identity. In the past, entire armies marched on strongholds, allowing our enemies to slip away with the stolen goods. This time, we sent a smaller force of 8 ships filled with elite soldiers to snatch our prize before they knew what happened. And Edward Drummond betrayed us." "Yes, my dear, and as a result, our plan failed in every way, in very strange ways. Instead of securing the treasure, Captain Drummond, working with the Order of Eos, managed to evacuate it, and once again it vanished into the night." "And then came the tsunami, the tidal wave," Catherine repeated his lie. At this, Newton interrupted the tale. The tsunami is a fabrication told to Queen Anne to explain what happened to my fleet. Tell her the truth, Bernard. Your uncle's fleet smashed the defenses at Fort Wallace before finding themselves in a trap. Against overwhelming odds, the Black Fleet triumphed thanks to its modern weaponry and stronger design. None of the 7 ships left the bay, but a small armada of merchant ships led by the late Woodes Rogers secured control of Madagascar waters. Despite our losses, this convey allowed us to control the narrative. The story of the tsunami. It was an unholy disaster of another kind. Betrayal is a two-edged sword, and those willing to betray often find themselves betrayed. Eos is utterly routed, and our new ally, Queen Rehena, rules the island. What do you know of the French Cathars? My modest education has left me ignorant of the Cathars. Of course, your specialty is current events, not 400-year-old massacres. The Cathars were a religious group with close ties to our thieving friends, and when the might of the Catholic Church decided to exterminate the threat to Christendom, they did not stand a chance. Locked away in their strongholds, the Cathars chose the ritual of Endura, or suicide. All across the highlands of Madagascar, the colonists took their lives by the thousands. Many men, women, and children died, yet many were liberated. How? Queen Rehena sent envoys to tell us of her active involvement in the revolution upon the island. She even managed to secure some of the lost relics, which she wants to trade for the return of her son. Her son? Bernard had created the cruel plot with John Yarland. A political prisoner to coerce her obedience, yet it turns out she's willingly aided us against Eos. The 12 cities were dead by the time our allies set foot to conquer them. Years of planning. So much went according to plan, but the victory was tarnished by Edward Drummond. Tell her about the capital. They called it Edinburgh Castle, where their elected monarch ruled. During the Battle of Antongal Bay, we assume shortly after Captain Drummond helped evacuate the treasures, the entire complex dissolved. A volcanic explosion? Catherine asked. Evil unleashed, from the descriptions we received. A vaporous cloud that dissolved anything it touched. Rock, metal, organic. For 3 days it swirled around, transforming the terrain into melted butter. The men withdrew to the battered ships until it cleared. What was it? Simply put, magic. But acquired magic. Stolen magic. These zealots saw it as a way to destroy the old while sanctifying the new. As you can see, we succeeded in dislodging them root and stem from Madagascar, but only because they chose it. If we can find that ship, we can crush the seed before it can germinate. Apparently the seed will be planted in America? Catherine smiled and shrugged. America? Bernard questioned. Immediately after the battle, Drummond was seen sailing north from Madagascar. Catherine smiled confidently. A lot can change in a year. As an outlaw from the British Empire, Captain Drummond sailed home, ahead of the news of his betrayal. By the time news of Madagascar reached you, he was already home in the Bahamas. From there, his destination is uncertain. Some reports have him going north to Bermuda. Others say he went to Jamaica and joined a crew under the alias Thatcher. The most credible involve him abandoning his ship at a place called Balachi, which means nothing to me. Care to explain? Newton explained. It is an indigenous tribe that lives along the Gulf of Mexico, which the French call Balachi. He likely brought his ship directly to Fort Maurepas, where one of the Lemoyne brothers commands. Jean-Baptiste, Bernard added. He's been my source of information for so long, he is threatened by my amazing niece. No, the elder, Pierre, Newton corrected Bernard and turned to Catherine. Pierre Lemoyne fought against Captain Norris, and when that path was stolen from him, he went to the Gulf to find a southern route for our former operative, Pierre Charles Lesueur. Bermuda or Palachi. Fort Maurepas is controlled by the Order of Eos, which would make sense. But Bermuda? That is strange. Lesueur's ship sank along with the philosopher's stone near Bermuda. You've done well, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine said. So the Order of Eos is our enemy? Drummond represents a group of religious zealots who would sacrifice thousands to wake the old gods and open the abyss to the evils within, Newton said. Our truest enemy remains the Catholic Church and its Jesuit order. The three of us are the defenders of humanity. So was it the Church who contacted Queen Rehena about our operation? Catherine asked. Why do you say that? Newton asked. Rumors, Catherine shrugged. Now that your net of merchants have returned, I heard a couple strange tales involving the Queen. Such as? Accounts from the survivors claim that prior to our arrival, a single pirate ship arrived at Queen Rehena's palace at Foul Point. I can only assume it wasn't one of our captains. If it was an agent of the Catholic Church, it'd likely be a French or Spanish vessel, Bernard added, and then showed deference to his young rival for attention. Did your contact get a description of it? Apparently, it was a ghost ship. No, Newton dismissed. Our enemies speak like this. We deal in facts. Give me the facts. The eyewitnesses claimed that Captain Kidd returned in the Adventure Prize and sent his first mate to the Queen, a man wearing a red eye patch. But Captain Kidd is dead, Bernard protested. I saw him executed. Hopefully, he will stay dead this time, Newton said. But I worry about this loose thread unraveling everything. We've expended vast resources taking Madagascar from our enemies, and now we must find new agents and new funds for our operations. Obviously, we must find and deal with Edward Drummond. But keep your ears open about a rogue pirate ship, captained by a man with a red eye patch, would you? Chapter 65, Bombay, India, 1706. What's taking them so long? Louis Armand Guerin worried as he waited for the skiff to return to the disguised white zombie. His looking glass studied the frenetic port along the western shores of India. Two mighty empires shared the port, Emperor Aurangzeb's Mughal Empire and Queen Anne's British Empire. Dozens of other countries used the harbor also, despite open war waging in Europe. Although surrounded by hundreds of vessels, Guerin felt no security as he nervously studied the water for dangers. There they are, Guerin muttered to himself upon seeing the skiff. A moment later, Jimmy Duke announced to the crew after spotting it himself. Impatience had soured the mood of the crew. The treasures collected from the burned wreck of the Adventure Galley turned out to be a small deposit on what most of the crew had hoped for. Certainly, they stayed for adventure, but none of them were periphery, and Guerin gravely worried about pushing them too far, especially with the latest gambit. Pierre Charles Lesueur, with nary a hair on his restored body, still sat apart from the crew, who still looked at him with wide eyes after he walked out of the mouth of hell without a scratch. If anything, the divine intervention brought Guerin more patience, but the miracle didn't put any money in the pockets of the crew. Benjamin Horne also sulked. Following the fall of Madagascar, he begged two courses of action: to scour the smoldering ruins of Madagascar vault, or to pursue Blackbeard's fleeing warship. The sewer verified the vessel had been loaded with Eos relics, which exasperated Horn and his Abyssinian officers. The skiff bounced into the side of the white zombie. While not Indian, Naro Ban had been chosen for the covert mission into the busy city. His aging navigator nodded in affirmation that the terms had been delivered to Emperor Aurangzeb's men. So close, yet so far away, Luis Armand mused. Duke, lift anchor. Del Toro, get us under away. The course? Del Toro asked with a sour expression. Bond knows the course. Dr. Barrow stood at the cabin door, his arms crossed. All the officers understood the brazen plan, but none of them liked it in the least, especially the doctor, who often acted as if he'd be the one to one day retire to a country cottage. So Garin avoided all of them and went down to the brig. There, in the same cell that held the arcane symbols and ancient language that began this side quest, arch-fiend Henry Longben Avery played cards with himself beside a chessboard waiting for Garin's next move. Seeing him, Avery slid it to the bars of the brig. The fuse has been lit, Garin said as he sat down at the stool outside of Avery's cell. Avery's face grew solemn. I don't see another way. Neither do I, Garin said in agreement. Are you sure you're willing to do your part? When Chief Halliburton showed up at my home, I wasn't ready to die. In lieu of you dropping me off on some tropical island, this is my best plan. But only if you survive to do your part. I plan on surviving, Garin said with a chuckle. It'll be a good death, Avery assessed the plan hatched over the past several months. A death of my choosing. It's all a man could ask for. I'd hate to think of what the Emperor would do to me if I were taken alive. We'll make sure that doesn't happen, Garin promised. I just hope Professor Farrow, Josiah Farrow, is worth all of this. Oh, he's worth it. Get him out of the clutches of Emperor Aurangzeb, and I'll gladly give you my death. Chapter 66, Mount Kailash, Tibet, 1706. Mount Kailash is a 21,000-foot peak located near the borders of Tibet and India. West of the Himalayan mountain range, Kailash uniquely stands alone on a plateau that feeds four of Asia's longest rivers, the Brahmaputra, the Sutlej, the Indus, and the Karnali, a tributary of the Ganges. Along with being the source of four rivers, it is also a sacred place in the religions of Hinduism, Bon, Buddhism, and Jainism. For the Tibetan Buddhists, it is known as Kangri Rinpoche, or Precious Snow Mountain, and is considered to be the navel of the universe. Another Tibetan religion, Bon, has several names for it in their sacred texts that recognize its place as a watershed for the continent. Water's Flower, Mountain of Seawater, and 9-stacked Swastika Mountain. The Bon also believe it is the abode of their sky goddess Saipaman. The Jains, an ancient Indian religious group, share the idea that it is a home for a deity, and for them, it is where their first leader gained enlightenment. For the adherents of Hinduism, it was a gateway to heaven and is a home of Shiva, who once trapped Ravana in the mountain for his crimes. Along with being a watershed, the ancient Hindu text Vishnu Purana described the mountain as a pillar of the world, with its four faces made of crystal, ruby, gold, and lapis lazuli, a deep blue volcanic stone. For Professor Josiah Farrow, Mount Kailash was now his prison. 9 months into his year-long expedition, he still marveled at the mountain each time he stepped out of his tent. Nagari, a local old man who now cooked for the royal expedition, sat on a stone beside the campfire and prepared a warm breakfast. Now that it was summer, overnight temperatures stayed above freezing, and many of the locals slept under the stars. Pharaoh still wore his wool and leather, even to bed. Although he'd grown up in the northern climate of the Massachusetts colony, the Harvard professor had never experienced the cold he felt under the previous winter, and he stood with his face to the sun to find warmth to thaw his frozen core. His captors stirred also. The Grand Mughals' men were being punished also. For months, none of them bothered to wear their uniforms or arm themselves, despite being royal guards of Emperor Aurangzeb. All had once been trusted, all had since failed, and each wanted an opportunity to redeem himself. Even though Professor Pharaoh knew them all by name, they were all the same, his captors. Only Akil Kam welcomed him with a smile and a wave. Although a thin man, Akil was a decade younger than Pharaoh, who was 50. He woke each day at peace with his royal father's lot in life for him. Akil showed up with a beverage, this time a steaming cup of tea. "It's going to be a beautiful day," the cheerful royal bastard said. "I suppose it is," Pharaoh said. Pharaoh agreed. "With such clear skies and light winds, we should be able to finish our reconnaissance of the eastern slope. It is time to break camp and move to the northern slope. We'll see what the day brings us. The weather in June can still bring terrible surprises. There are a few places I'd like to revisit before breaking camp." Akil denied his request politely. "Get some breakfast, and we'll head out." Pharaoh scratched his blond beard and walked over to Nagari. "The lotus blooms in summer," the cook said, passing him a bowl. The good weather seemed to lift his spirits also. "Perhaps she will open her petals to you today. She knows how you've suppered at the base of the slopes." "I appreciate your kind words," Pharaoh answered. But you and I both know the holy mountain would not reveal her secrets to a man like Aurangzeb. But it is not the emperor who is looking here for secrets. Instead, a holy man from the far side of the world has come with his own questions. Perhaps she will reveal some of her ancient secrets to you alone. Anything she reveals to me will be seen by Akil, or our escort. What is it, day 293? I doubt today will be any different. I don't understand why you don't vanish in the middle of the night. I've told you all about the villages north and west of here. Why don't you run away? Do you want to go back to prison? I was only in prison a short time, and I was brought to Lahore for my knowledge in my head. I was imprisoned in a library, an interpreter of legends, which is, ironically, the same thing I did before I left my position at Harvard. Emperor Aurangzeb is an old man, even if you do find the cave that still holds the, Pharaoh grinned and finished, prima materia, the building blocks of life. You don't believe the tales of Mount Kailash being the navel of the universe? My navel held anything other than filth. Pharaoh laughed and finished his bowl of broth and handed it back to his greatest pupil, a retired herder who'd learned English in only 600 lessons over meals. Back in his shelter, he found his insulated fur-lined cap that covered his ears with a strap that tied under his chin and also covered his thinning blonde hair. He double-checked his knapsack for the proper maps and sketchbooks, and then found his faithful walking stick. Although fit and healthy for 50, he knew his body could not afford an injury, so he walked with the stick wherever he went. He held it as he knelt down on his knees to pray. Born to Puritan parents in Massachusetts, Pharaoh still felt he was a Calvinist at heart, even though his ever-expanding worldviews led to his removal at Harvard, which brought him into the service of another former pupil, Thomas Tew. His private research into old conspiracies swept him up. Tew brought him to the well of initiation, where he laid eyes on something that was not made by the hands of man, the Odin Stone. It was only the corner of an ebony slab of stone, shattered at its center, and at first appeared to be engraved with ancient runes. But the runes were not made by hand or tool. They floated at different depths within the black mineral. We believe this stone contains an ancient language. It has been guarded by Eos for generations, Thomas Tew had once explained. Do your legends tell who made such a thing? It was made by a sorcerer, an alchemist, who wrote magic within it, magic that would be used to save the world. But it is broken, Pharaoh stated. It's incomplete. The other fragments are known to us, scattered around the world lest they fall into the hands of our enemies, Tew added. This black stone is so old, however, that we no longer know the language or how to sing it. Sing it? We believe it is a song, Tew explained. We'd like your help in translating the song. So Josias, Pharaoh, spent a summer in Madagascar trying to decipher the language. It had been so exciting that Pharaoh and Tew had been reckless in their enthusiasm to unlock it, and their great interest in Egypt, ancient Aksum, and the ruins of Jerusalem caught the attention of another great predator, Emperor Aurangzeb. For my sins, I suffer here at the top of the world. His morning prayers complete, Pharaoh walked out to the waiting expedition members. The base of Mount Kailash formed a near square with each slope spanning 5 miles. Over the past 9 months, the expedition team had methodically explored the western, southern, and now eastern slope of the mountain, leaving the northern face for the summer months when the sun was highest in the sky. The hike to the northeast corner took them an hour, and once they passed the rusty patch on the slope and found the aqua pool at the foothill, they took a short break before eyeing the next section. It was another 2-mile hike to the peak overlooking Toe Print Glacier, which began at the dead center of the peak and sloped to the northern base. With it being the north-facing slope, the mile-wide depression filled with snow and ice that never melted and fed the raging rivers flowing north. An entrance covered in ice, Pharaoh theorized. How many of the old myths and legends tell the same story with different names? With their breath caught, they began their walk up the rocky ridge that led to the top of the glacier. Nagari, he said to the slowest member of the expedition, who lugged his cooking equipment, tell me the story again of the thumbprint. It happened during the conflict of Shiva and Ravana. Ravana, the demon god. Shiva, known as both the great god as well as the destroyer. The telling varies, but in all of them, Ravana wanted Kailash for himself and conspired to keep it. Why? Pharaoh pressed. What value did it bring him? It was Shiva's home, Akil answered, despite being Muslim like his father. Actually, it was the place where Shiva entered our world, Nagari corrected. Ah, the navel of the universe. Yes, but Shiva and his wife Parvati had long ago left for a better home. Yet he left behind great magic within the mountain itself, and a great sword which Ravana used to unfasten the roots of the mountain. Yes, but why would he do that? What purpose did he have in stealing the mountain? Mount Kailash collects the winter snows, and when the time comes, it releases the waters for the great rivers. If Ravana took Mount Kailash for himself, he would stop the seasons from happening. Time would cease, and all prophecies would be hindered or forestalled. Yes, well, whatever his selfish intentions, Ravana used his 20 arms to lift Kalish from its foundations, which threatened to disrupt the entire world. Both humans and gods trembled at the menace posed to them, and sweet Parvati convinced mighty Shiva to intervene. So Shiva pressed Kalish back into place with his great toe. Don't forget the army of monkeys, Akil added. Oh yes, an army of monkeys overwhelmed the base of Kalish, distracting Ravana and keeping his attention on the valley. I've heard versions where Shiva and Ravana battle with their magic swords. In the end, Ravana was trapped inside the mountain. For 1,000 years, Achilles finished. Yes. But, Pharaoh prompted, knowing he was defeated, Ravana manufactured his own release from his prison. First, he composed a song that he gave Parvati upon a stone tablet. When the song was sung, he would be released from his earthly prison. Next, he cut off one of his heads and buried it in a secret place outside of Mount Kalish. Veritas caput, the truth about the head. Why did he cut off his head? If the song was sung, he'd be released and given a new body. But if the song was never sung, and his body remained trapped inside of Kalish, then when his head was eventually found, it would open its mouth and sing the song, bringing about his own release. Nagari's version is much more interesting than your southern version, Pharaoh teased. So if we do find the navel, will the demon king Ravana still be locked away? Akil looked at Nagari. Clearly, neither had a conclusion to the 10-headed demon god of the Hindu. Eos searches for a fallen god. Is this the answer to their riddle? First, we need to find the entrance, don't we? Once they reached the marker from the previous day's work, the guards produced their 8-foot metallic pry bars and began to hoist and flip stones while he and Akil used rope and stakes to mark the search area. 2 years earlier, Emperor Aurangzeb gave his theory. The entrance was covered by a rockside or by ice. Along with the imprisoned Ravana, Mount Kalish hid the magical stones used to bring the universe into creation. Now my penance for befriending pirates is serving a madman. As the two began to place the string marking the y-axis for the search grid, Nagari called out from his small cookfire. When Pharaoh turned, he saw a caravan of at least 100 Marwawi horses. Perhaps my father has died and the country has erupted in war between my brothers, Akil offered. Or perhaps they are here for me, Josiah Pharaoh worried. Sold to the higher bidder. Chapter 67. Aboard the White Zombie, near Sri Lanka, 1706. I've been pretending to be a pirate. It's time to truly become one. Luis Armand Guerin lowered his scope. Beside him, Narrow Bond watched the same ship as it pulled out of busy Colombo harbor. She's flying a Dutch East India Company flag, Bond added, and Guerin's scope flew to his good eye. Show me the seal. Show it to me. The feet of Quartermaster Manuel del Toro appeared below the eyepiece of the scope. The ship is ready on your command, sir. The boys are ready for a chase, but we only get one chance. From the crow's nest, Jimmy Duke hollered to his anchoring crew. Guerin lowered his scope for a moment to see his bosun scampering down the deck. Raising the scope again, he now saw the second flag, the Mughal Imperial flag. Seeing the green and gold flag, Guerin knew the odds were in his favor. But Colombo was an international trade port with hundreds of ships departing a day. It's the Golden Sun, Bond confirmed. The ship flies an Imperial seal. The crew cheered. Let's chase her down, Guerin said, and from the far side of the bay, the Predator prepared to hunt its prey. A few miles from the bay, the Dutch ship continued to track to the northwest, and the spirits of the men increased as the odds increased dramatically of it being the right ship. Lesueur's shadow fell on him. I can't believe this is working, Garin said with just a trace of giddiness. An overly complicated gambit. Yes, but Nara was right, Garin said of the officer beside him. If we'd simply handed over Avery, we might have been able to collect the reward money. Might. When we asked for a prisoner exchange, we've insulted the Emperor. We need this gambit to get Pharaoh. Will we ever return to the Mississippi River? LeSueur muttered. In good time. Once we've collected Pharaoh, we will soon make the turn for the land of the Blue Woman. First, the gambit. Remind your men about the nature of this attack. I don't want things to go awry. Just the sight of LeSueur should make those Dutch sailors surrender. Nothing of Pierre Charles LeSueur remained. Charlie Johnson still had the monstrous frame of the fearsome fur trader, but the hair that finally regrew had been bleached of all black ink, leaving him with a beard and full head full of white hair. With his flesh again, what? With his flesh again having a bronzed hue, he looked much younger than 50. Between Papa Bones' voodoo christening and surviving the explosion, Charlie was a god to his men. Perhaps Gaspar was right about this man being marked by God. A few hours went by as the distance narrowed. Benjamin Horne readied the cannons, and Charlie stood with his boarding parties. Raise the flag, Garin said, and fire a few warning shots. With the cargo they carry, they shouldn't want to fight, would you? Surprisingly, the ship fired a few shots back at them. One cannonball sent a sliver into the forearm of LeSueur, and half the crew stopped fighting when he pulled the splinter out and blood oozed from the wound. So he's not immortal. Garin spotted Giovanni Naufragio at the front of the ship as part of the defensive measures if things went horribly wrong and the enemy decided to fight to the death. Sharpen those chisels, Giovanni. The carpenter nodded. Take down those masts, Mr. Horne. The guns of the white zombies sunk its teeth into the masts and sails, crippling the Dutch merchant vessel in minutes, prompting the white flag of surrender. Unlike most pirates, the white zombie hunted for a specific purpose. The white zombie slid up next to the Dutch ship. Master Horne's guns were ready to split her in half. Most of the Dutch crew stood at the rail, a sign of surrender. When the hooks flew from the white zombie, the Dutch crew helped secure them. Well done, boys. Well done. I am Gareth Legrand, captain of the White Zombie, and I hold your lives in my hand. Surrender your ships and its possessions, and all of you will be allowed to live. From the poop deck, the Dutch captain presented himself. I am Captain Adrian Van Brock, captain of the Starling. You imperil yourself with this act. While we carry a load of cinnamon from Mumbai, we also carry an imperial ambassador for the Mughal Empire. Yes, I am very aware of this fact, which is why we are boarding you, Garin continued, speaking in Dutch. How is his health? Captain Van Brock turned to his officers. No one wants to die for a dead man. To help them arrive at a logical conclusion, Garin added, May I speak to Ambassador Abdi Tari? I heard his health has suddenly worsened. Again, Captain Van Broek spoke directly to his officers, and a moment later, 3 Mughal men dressed in fine clothes joined him on the deck. Here is Ambassador Tari. What is your business with him? Garin turned to find Dr. Barrows standing in the doorway of the cabin. Is that the ambassador? Dr. Barrows shook his head. Garin turned back to the Starling. That is not the man we poisoned back in Colombo. In fact, we recognize the impostor as the ambassador's servant. A ripple of unease covered the men of the Starling. You carry the body of the ambassador, don't you? Tell his men that if you peacefully surrender, we will see that the ambassador's body is brought home." The Moguls and Dutch conferred for a moment. "You may board." The planks were readied, and Garin called down to his deck. "Charlie, remember the gambit. Secure the Moguls and any paperwork they have." The seizure of the Dutch ship happened without another shot. During his time with Captain Kidd, Garin had seized dozens of ships while gathering intelligence for Isaac Newton rather than gathering plunder. In the early months of this enterprise, Garin boarded and captured ships, while Kidd stood where he now stood. I could have been a legendary pirate. The crew of the Starling took prostrate positions on the main deck as Charlie's gun crews stood over them while other crews searched the ship. After half an hour of waiting, Charlie climbed the deck to stand beside Captain Van Brock. With everything secure, he signaled to Garin. "Here's what will happen next," Garin shouted over. "You and select officers are going to be brought over to my ship, where you'll be held as hostages. Half of your crew are going to be marooned at Kiltan Island, with enough food to last them over a month. If all goes well, you will personally be able to rescue them when this ordeal is over. Do you understand so far?" "It is your death sentence you request," Van Broek said. Garin laughed heartily. "Then it will make me the most wanted man on 4 continents, if Madagascar is considered part of Africa. I've made worse enemies than Emperor Aurangzeb or Prince William of Orange. I will need my man to lock the Mughals in your brig. I'll explain the whole thing when you're brought over. It's rather complicated. Charlie, bring him over." Both decks flowed with motion, and tensions remained high, even as Giovanni Naufragio found his Dutch counterpart to immediately begin repairs. With the Dutch crew divided, Lesueur gathered from securing his Mogul prisoners, with Captain Van Broek at his side. "The ambassador's identity is verified. Here is the official correspondence proving it," Lesueur offered. "Your gambit might get you in the front door, but then what? I wish I could unleash you and your axe upon the whole of Bombay, but to get what I want, deception will matter." "All for one man?" Lesueur asked. "You're here today because of this man. I could have put you in your Cuban grave. Show some patience, Charlie. Whatever is waiting for you in the land of the Blue Woman can wait. We might only get one shot at doing this properly. Now, go inspect your new ship with Naufragio. Pick your men wisely and send half over to the White Zombie. I'll escort our new friend to the brig." The officers were chained together in Garin's quarters, and half the crew were chained on the deck. Garin separated them to avoid any attempts at mutiny until they reached Kiltan Island. Garin led their captain to the brig, where Boatswain Drake Murray met them with the keys. "Captain Van Broek, I'd like to introduce you to the most wanted man in the world. Apart from yours truly, the infamous Captain Henry Long Ben Avery." Van Broek gasped at the name. "So you managed to get the ambassador?" Avery asked, raising his eyebrows. "Captain Van Broek is a rational man who might end up surviving this if he plays nicely," Garin explained. Avery winked at Van Broek as he entered the cell. "I bet you're wondering what's about to happen to your ship and crew. My plan required both, and if you comply, you'll get them all back when this is over. Or you'll be as dead as Captain Avery," Garin said, prompting an eye roll from his prisoner. "And don't be taking credit for my plan. Our plan," Avery said. "You might have come up with this sleight of hand trick, but I'm the one that came up with the big finale." "Our plan, then," Garin conceded. "The Lord preserves the fool, the good book says. Just as he punishes the wicked," Avery added. "And I'm ready to atone for my sins with a final act of wickedness." Chapter 68, Bombay, India, 1707. By privately serving Emperor Aurangzeb, Korgi Baba had become a fat, wealthy man, but he'd also struggled to live down a public shame, losing his ship to Captain Kidd a decade earlier. Now he had an opportunity to restore his importance to the Emperor by identifying a man's face. And soon I will have the head of Captain Gareth Legrand. Several other men joined him at the table. Following a ransom request involving Henry Avery, all 5 of them had a part to play in the Emperor's response. The British host and military man, William Burneston, held the meeting at the military post used to secure the interests of the East Indian Trading Company. Today, the British possess the island on the other side of the Ulhas River. Tomorrow, who could tell? The Imperial Admiral Daud Khan Pani sat beside him, and despite being a guest of the British, he ran the meeting as Emperor Aurangzeb wished. Prison warden Kanhoji sat beside, bringing with him the subject of the ransom, prisoner Josiah Farrell. Baba's jaw dropped when he learned Farrell was still alive. 12 years earlier, Baba captained the Kedah merchant, which lingered behind the convoy led by the Ganges Swai. Part of his mission had been a success, killing Captain Thomas II and capturing the religious scholar Josiah Farrell. Across the table, Bombay's Governor Geyer sat, slightly disinterested by a crime that happened long before he arrived. Had former Governor Thomas Pitt sat there, the British involvement would have been more motivated. Next to him, a local religious leader, Imam Shah, sat, very interested by the strange collection of people. Korgi Baba knew the last man who sat across from him, Augie Puri Calendar, an East Indian Company trade representative who knew Henry Avery prior to the Ganges Swai incident. Several months earlier, Calendar stepped out of his office to receive Legrand's letter. "This is how the trap will work," Admiral Pani explained. While Captain Legrand might think he has the advantage by setting date and place, Emperor Aurangzeb will not negotiate with infidel pirates, regardless of what they offer. Admiral Pani referenced the map of Bombay on the table. Bombay was a series of islands stacked lightly against the delta of a river. At its widest, the British had a fort overlooking the bay, which was large enough to make it an international port. These cowards have chosen the island, thinking the British will somehow offer immunity, but Commander Burneston will have a company of men lying in wait once Henry Avery is revealed. "Why does it have to be a mosque?" Burneston asked. "Tensions between the British and Muslims are still high. If this doesn't go smoothly..." Captain Legrand knows Emperor Aurangzeb is a righteous man, which is why he chose a holy place for the meeting. Warden Kanhoji will have 4 imperial troops within the mosque to make sure the transfer of prisoners happens in a pleasing manner. And Mr. Calendar will also be there to make sure we are receiving the real Henry Avery. As if anticipating objections, Admiral Pani added, "The ground between the shore and mosque is not holy." Imam Shah added, "The mosque is built upon a high hill facing east. While it seems isolated from the water, the hike up the hill takes several minutes, and on the backside of the hill, the streets of Bombay are crowded. That is how we'll hide Commander Burneston's men. We'll have them hidden in 2 alleys. When the signal is given, we will cut off these pirates from returning to the bay. Regardless of what happens on the island, Captain Korgi will help identify his former ship and its red-eyed captain, Gareth Legrand." Admiral Pani took a moment to drink his wine. If this arrogant man had simply brought Captain Avery to us, The emperor would have made him a wealthy and celebrated hero, but when he gave conditions to the exchange, he became complicit in the crimes. Don't think of this as a prisoner exchange, but as capturing two dangerous fugitives, Henry Avery and Legrand. At this, Corgi Baba found his voice again. Captain Legrand was part of Captain Kidd's crew. At his insistence, my ship, the Quedagh Merchant, was illegally seized and stolen. He is a menace to civilized society. Then why go through this charade of bringing the prisoner? Governor Gare asked. As soon as they sail into the harbor, blow them out of the water. As much as Emperor Aurangzeb enjoys his American magi, he wants vengeance for his murdered daughter. Acquiring Henry Avery alive is our first priority. All eyes went to Calendar. It's been a decade, but I should be able to identify the scoundrel. Admiral Pawnee nodded. We expect Captain Legrand to be wary. He won't put Avery at risk until he believes the situation is under control. Warden Khan Hoji shook his head. Then why are we putting Pharaoh in the mosque at the start? The Emperor must appear to operate in good faith, Admiral Pawnee explained. If the terms are not met, Captain Legrand could cause international damage by crying foul and keeping Avery. We assume he'll send some minion in the mosque first, identify Professor Pharaoh, and then send a signal to bring Avery. Even this act must be shown patience. If they send an impostor, and we go for the bait, the real Avery could vanish forever. We must make sure Avery is delivered before we act. No one has asked why Legrand wants Pharaoh, or why the Emperor is willing to double-cross to keep him. A decade earlier, Corgi Baba sat with a different admiral as they discussed plans for a different trap, capturing two. The Emperor's spies knew the truth about Madagascar, that instead of pirates, a secret society grew in isolation. With the young Americans serving as presider of the Free States, a new religious revolution was building. By this time in the Emperor's life, his obsessive mind had already moved from Islam to understanding foreign religions, especially one of the oldest beliefs, alchemy. So the Emperor publicly offered a trade of religious artifacts with the Sultan of Arabia, knowing Presider II would risk his own life to obtain a treasure far more valuable than an earthly princess. Captain Baba and the Quedagh Merchant hunted down the tail of the pirate armada. Unfortunately, Thomas II died in the capture, but once Aurangzeb learned the truth of who and what Josiah Pharaoh was, the enterprise momentarily paid off. Years later, Corgi Baba was on another covert mission for the Emperor when he crossed paths with Captain Kidd. With the British as our ally, Admiral Pawnee concluded once the meal ran its course, the guns of the fort will prevent any ship from leaving the harbor, and I will have warships hidden behind the shield islands and smaller crafts ready if the men abandon ship and flee. By agreeing to do the prisoner exchange in Bombay, they are already trapped. They just don't know it yet. Just as I trapped the King of the Templars, only to see the other rats gnaw their legs off and take the Ganges Swai. I just hope there's something left of my ship when the dust settles. Chapter 69, Bombay, India, 1707. Josiah Pharaoh smelled the ocean through the stench of the slums, giving him hope that he wasn't being led to an execution. The men who accompanied him from Mount Kailash did not speak English, or any other language for that matter, bringing a strange silence to the end of his prison sentence. As with his previous trip, Pharaoh counted the rate of passage. Now the passage was slow through the congested city streets where he visualized one block at a time. Over the past month, travel had been on open roads, where dozens of miles passed under hoofs. With Kailash as the axis, the length of travel could have brought him in any direction, but based on the direction of the sun, he knew he traveled south, to either freedom or execution. If the elderly emperor had indeed died, The expedition should have ended with Pharaoh's blood being spilled on the base of Mount Kailash. If the emperor was dying, the journey most likely would have ended hundreds of miles earlier at an imperial palace. When Pharaoh smelled the sea, and then the stench of Bombay, he began to dream of freedom. The carriage door opened and he found himself on a hill. A quick glance back at the carriage revealed a sprawling city below the hill. A glance forward revealed a brilliantly blue Islamic mosque with 2 soldiers standing at the doorway. His eyes darted to the side, spotting a soldier hiding in the nearby alleyway. To the other side, he noticed another alleyway with another conspicuous soldier. I'm bait for a trap. Yet, a large cemetery with dozens of small mausoleums separated the mosque from the city by 100 yards. Even though the mosque blocked much of his view, he could also see past it to a large bay on the eastern side of the hill. Bombay. He'd last seen it 12 years earlier after his capture. Warden Kanhoji led him forward. The exterior of the mosque was skirted with pillars, each capable of hiding men in ambush, but as he passed, each of them proved vacant. Inside of the mosque, he passed through another series of pillars that supported the tall domed ceiling, but aside from a well-dressed Englishman and 2 guards at the front doors, it was empty. Finally, he saw another person, an imam, standing on the opposite side of the cavernous space, in front of an ornate mihrab. His head spun to both sides, confirming that there were just 4 of them. In front of the imam, a small chest waited on the floor. Surely not severance pay. Is this an exchange? The warden addressed the imam. Any sign of pirates? Pirates? Has the Order of Eos found me? No, but the sun has just set, the imam said. Per written instructions, we vacated the mosque at sunset, leaving only the guards and me stationed at the door. For all we know, the pirates had been faking the evening prayers in the crowd. And the signal? The warden asked. I placed the torch in the eastern doorway as instructed. Pharaoh located the burning torch, but his captor's eyes intercepted. Don't hope for rescue. You'll be back with company in a British jail in Bombay Castle by midnight. After a few minutes of waiting, Pharaoh learned the name of the Englishman, Calendar. Both Calendar and Imam drifted to the open door overlooking the bay. 2 more soldiers flanked the eastern door, but Pharaoh remained unattended at the center of the mosque. Just as had been the case in the Himalayas, space provided its own kind of guard. The entire facility was being watched from a distance, so he did not entertain foolish thoughts of running. He looked back to the chest. Payment. The moment Thomas II died on the deck of the Amity, Pharaoh's importance to the free clans grew more valuable. But within minutes of capture, he'd been whisked away on Captain Baba's Quetta merchant, never to learn what happened to the rest of the convoy or the leadership of the free clans back in Madagascar. His time in the Gujarat prison led him to the conclusions based on the questioning, but it had been a decade since his transfer to the palace, a living book placed in the emperor's vast collection of ancient texts. What has transpired to this moment? May I join you? Pharaoh called out. All 4 guards stepped into view. Calendar stepped back into the doorway and waved him over. The warden escorted him step for step. Once in the doorway, Pharaoh understood the strategic location of the site. A 1/4-mile slope descended to the busy harbor below, with the ports further inland, or across the bay on the mainland, and the British port on the tip of the island of the mouth. The shore below was undeveloped, which is why it was easy to spot a single vessel approaching. Who is it? Pharaoh asked. More likely than not, just a messenger, Calendar explained. Do you see those ships in the distance? They are to make sure you do not leave India. Ah, and that patrol down there? They are going to find out if we are dealing with fools. Who would want me after all this time? The patrol at the bottom of the hill were not fools. A small rowboat separated from the vessel, and upon landing, the patrol advanced upon it. "10 minutes passed, and then a solitary figure began walking up the hill, away from the station patrol. It was too dark to make sense of the figure carrying the torch, but he advanced at a leisurely pace, as if strolling through a park. A wide-brimmed hat further hid the face in shadow. "Your weapon, sir," the warden said, when the man transitioned to the lowest stone balcony nearest the complex. The man's belt was unbuckled, and the sword set down upon the railing. The man called out in English, "May I approach, or is there another patrol waiting to ambush me?" "Approach," the warden said. The man continued his approach up the stairs, and even though a small man, his presence filled the mosque. The fellow looked around the high ceilings of the mosque instead of at the men fearfully studying him. "Where is Captain Avery?" Calendar asked. Long been? My God, is that what this is all about? The question brought the gaze of the pirate along with his eye patch, which had a red gem sewn onto the patch. The man continued to look around the mosque and said, "When I give the signal, we've done our part. We brought Professor Farrow as requested. We've brought the chest of money as requested. Where is the captain?" "We had to make sure it was not a double-cross," Red Eye said, and then began to stroll around the mosque. He checked behind pillars and looked in alcoves until finally going all the way to the door leading to the city. He stood there for a few minutes, as if taunting the Mughals' men. Next, he stepped to the side of the western entrance, dramatically flinging open the side doors one by one, pausing when he found a dark room lit by the glow of wicks burning incense. On the floor, a coffin. Finally, he turned back to the warden. "How am I to know that this is the real Professor Farrow?" At the men's silence, Red Eye approached, standing almost toe-to-toe with him. He had a surprisingly youthful face with blonde hair under his hat. "Who is he?" Farrow cleared his throat and swallowed hard. "I can assure you, Captain, I am the one and only Josiah Farrow." "Just like I am the one and only Captain Legrand? It wouldn't surprise us if the Emperor scoured the jails for a man matching your likeness and coached him. Let's put you to the test." Legrand reached into his pockets, retrieving a cigar. He held it in his hand for a moment longer, while his other hand searched the interior of his jacket. "I seem to have misplaced my matches." Then his eyes widened. "No, but this will do." In his other hand, he held a sheet of paper. "I have a few questions for you to prove you are really Josiah Farrow. When I am convinced, I will give the signal for Henry Avery to be brought to us." "I can assure you," Warden Kanjoji said, "this man is Josiah Farrow. I personally escorted him from Emperor Aurangzeb to Bombay." Legrand turned back to Farrow. "When Thomas II was slain and you were captured by Captain Baba, I believe, what personally happened to you?" "I was taken off the ship along with my possessions and brought to an Indian vessel." "Yes, the Kedah merchant, it turns out." "It happened so fast I never learned the name of the ship," Farrow answered. "And you were kept in Captain Baba's cabin until you were brought to Gujarat?" "No, I was locked away in the brig." Legrand smiled. "Good answer. And during your journey across the Indian Ocean, locked in your cell with your possessions, you took it upon yourself to carve inscriptions upon the walls, correct?" Farrow felt his heart racing. The runes had saved his life. "Yes." "Why?" "I knew any men put in the brig would most likely be either European or pirate, and if that was the case, I wanted them to know what happened to me. I wanted news to travel. I didn't want to just vanish from the face of the earth. And here I am, your rescuer. Last question. Along with your manifesto carved into the wood, you left a few symbols. I'm going to show you these symbols, and if you can tell me what they represent, you'll have proven that you are indeed Professor Pharaoh." How bizarre. He nodded and tightened his eyes. Legrand pointed to the symbol on the paper. "That is the symbol for the Philosopher's Stone." Legrand flashed another. "That is the symbol for copper." A third. "Ursa Major and Ursa Minor." A fourth, which gave Pharaoh pause. "The signet ring of King Solomon." Legrand ripped off his eye patch to reveal a healthy blue eye. He extended his hand. "Pleased to meet you, Professor Pharaoh. I'm Jimmy Duke of Boston. I've heard a lot about you." Chapter 70. Bombay, India, 1707. Jimmy Duke tossed the imitation patch to the ground. "I'm convinced you've brought Pharaoh, but I am still not convinced you're operating in good faith. Twice you've intercepted us with the intent on stealing Avery and keeping Pharaoh," Duke said in reference to the patrol at the shore and the soldiers waiting in the mosque. From the look in their eyes, they showed disappointment that it wasn't really Captain Gareth Legrand. Garin was right about the trap. So he called out, "In this holy house of worship, the Emperor is prepared to break his word and act like a thief?" The three officials nervously looked at each other. "Yes, we have guards posted to ensure the safety of Pharaoh. And yes, we intercepted your arrival, but only to make sure some random citizen was not interfering." Duke scoffed. "Your men only allowed me passage when they thought I was Captain Legrand. I'm betting one of you is here to identify Avery. This is all a trap, isn't it?" "No, no," they protested. Duke grinned. "If the Emperor is operating in good faith, convince me, and I'll give the signal to bring Henry Avery here," Duke said, stripping off most of his clothing. "Professor Pharaoh, I need you to strip down also, but not to your skivvies." Pharaoh began to strip down. "If you want Avery, convince me," Duke repeated to the officials. "How? What do you request?" "Two requests. Call in the guards from the western doors, and send the guards from the eastern doors to the two adjacent alleys where your soldiers are lying in wait. Tell them they are to remain where they are until Avery is brought up to the mosque, and then they are to remain where they are until Professor Pharaoh and I have traveled back down the hill to our waiting ship. Understood?" They must have ships waiting to capture us in the harbor, Duke realized as they discussed the proposal. When they agreed, Duke knew it. A moment later, the eastern guards trotted off and the western guards stepped into the mosque. "Thank you," Duke said. "Now I will give the signal for Avery." Duke walked over to the eastern doors facing the bay, and with the adjacent torch, he lit a cigar and then removed the torch from its holder to wave it 3 times. Stepping back in, he puffed away at the cigar for a moment. "Now, if you'll come with me, we need to visit the coffin of the recently deceased Ambassador Abdi Tari." Out of curiosity, the men followed him all the way to the open doors along the rear of the mosque, to the one where incense burned. He paused in the front of the coffin, glancing at the small holes along its base. The details of Louis Armand Guérin's plan had been moved into a position a week earlier, including the dead ambassador. Not a week, days earlier. Right now, all eyes are following a slow-moving rowboat traveling to the shore, when the real Long Ben Avery is already here. "Come, I'll show you." Duke watched the guards slip their hands into their tunics. Unarmed? Doubtful. Guérin spent weeks working out what to do if he were emperor. Arming the guards seemed obvious. Duke sat beside the coffin and glanced up at the men watching. Poor Captain Avery has had a rough few years, especially in the last 2 days. But I can assure you he is very much alive in here. Jimmy Duke slid off the lid a few inches and his hand reached under the feet of the wrapped body to find the smooth handles of two familiar friends. Two pistols pointed at the face of the guards, temporarily ignoring the Englishmen, Warden and Imam, who he didn't worry about. Move, over to the coffin. I need your help getting Long Ben Avery out of there." The guards hesitated for just a moment until they recognized the threat posed to them by the pistols. The shrouded corpse wiggled, pausing the efforts of both men as they stood at the edge of the coffin. Finally, the white burial fabric was torn away, and the head and torso of Henry Avery emerged from beneath a death shroud believed to belong to Ambassador Tari. Jimmy Duke remained ready, watching the stunned warden and cleric as Avery fully emerged from the coffin. So far, so good. Sending Henry Avery to the mosque in a coffin had been the most outlandish and necessary part of the plan. Avery's ashen eyes showed no emotion, passing from his former captor to his new captor, until he locked eyes with Josiah Farrow. "All of this just for you." "We don't have time for reunions," Duke barked. "All of you except Professor Farrow need to sit on the floor against the wall. Now." Even Henry Avery sat down, his shackles still secure on his wrists and ankles. "Quickly, Professor. You're about to witness my greatest heist. Now use the fabric to bind their wrists and hands." Farrow obliged while Jimmy Duke stood in the doorway. Once completed, he immediately set down the pistols and began to change into the uniform of the guards and retrieved his guns. "You too." "This is madness," Farrow said when Duke pointed to the extra guard clothing. "Yes, which is why I volunteered to be the one," Duke said with a wink. In just a few seconds, Farrow transformed himself also, including a turban upon his head. Finally, Duke walked over to where Captain Avery sat beside the coffin. "Are you still willing to do this? Or what? Get tortured to death in front of the Emperor? I died the moment I set foot in the Ganji Sawai. Yes, I am willing." Duke set the pistol on the floor 5 feet from where Avery sat. Next, he took several quick puffs from the cigar and then examined the embers inside before placing it in Avery's bound hands. Another sweep of his remaining pistol reminded the prisoners to keep their place as Avery struggled to stand. Avery deserves a horrible death. When Avery just stood there, he looked at the pistol on the ground and then to the coffin. "So?" Duke asked of the two choices. "I am no coward," Avery said of the pistol. "Give me Odin's death. He'll take out his enemies during his own death." Duke thought and sighed. "Could I do the same?" Duke leaned over the coffin, found the discreet looped fabric along the edges, and lifted the bottom platform from the coffin, revealing the explosives and their detonation fuses. "If you want to live, Professor, stay on my heels." Duke grabbed Farrow and jogged to the western doorway, standing in it. "They will think we're the guards." He heard Avery light the fuse. Then he shouted in rehearsed Farsi, "It is a trap!" Duke ran through the cemetery. Farrow ran behind him. Benjamin Horne emphasized they'd only have 10 seconds to get away from the mosque. "It's a trap!" he shouted to the confused troops waiting in the alleys. Chaos would be his shield. It was closer for the troops to run to the mosque than to the central entrance of the cemetery, which they did. No sounds came from the mosque. A single pistol shot meant Avery shot himself or had to fend off the Emperor's men within the mosque. The streets of Bombay would shelter them, and the dark streets waited just a few yards ahead. If he couldn't get them before the soldiers intercepted him, he would stop and wait for the explosion. 10 seconds, Horne had promised. The central gate loomed. The stunned troops began to emerge from the wings and headed to the mosque. Did the fuse go out? Then a thunderous explosion reverberated through the still Bombay air, filling the cemetery, eastern slope, and even the distant bay with dust, debris, and shards of blue. Chapter 71. Louis Armand Guerin could see the two figures running from the cemetery. Even with one eye, he could see the uniforms of two Mughal soldiers running straight for the central gate. Even though his men insisted on a Legrand decoy inside the mosque, Garin insisted on being close should the plan work. He rose from his hiding spot, stepping out of the shadow along the edge of the building. If need be, he was ready for a foot race to the ship. Although he couldn't see it, he knew the captured staff of Ambassador Abdi Tari would be either rowing an imposter Henry Avery to shore or walking up the hill. If the Emperor's men didn't zealously kill them, they would be able to explain how Henry Avery wound up inside of the mosque. The local Bombay wharf rats, already criminals in the eyes of the imperial law, would leave the naval blockade deep into the bay on a fruitless chase, for they knew how to abandon a skiff and swim to safety. The distant net of warships filled the bay would catch nothing, for neither the White Zombie nor the captured Starling came anywhere near the mouth of the bay or the British fort. Bombay, after all, had a western shore behind the bay. Garin gasped. Sweet heavens, Duke has him. At 50 yards, Garin saw the face of Jimmy Duke and a Caucasian that was certainly not Henry Avery. A flash momentarily lit the interior of the mosque. A moment later, the dome lifted, the walls buckled out, and then a cloud of chaos grew, swallowing Duke and Pharaoh just as they cleared the central gate. An act of revenge from him, Long Ben Avery. During the months Henry Avery spent locked in the brig with the White Zombie, Garin had spent countless lunches with his valuable prisoner, devising plans with the doomed man. Years earlier, when Garin first realized he needed Pharaoh's help unlocking the great alchemy puzzle given to him, the only bit of leverage he had was to find the most wanted man alive for the Emperor. Once he procured him, he needed a delivery method that could guarantee a prisoner exchange. During these discussions with his officers and Avery, Long Ben always reminded them that it ended gruesomely for him. Once in the possession of the Emperor, Long Ben would face some of the most horrific tortures found in the archives of the Imperial Library. Merciful poisons were discussed and denied. Time in the brig allowed Long Ben to imagine what he would do in the Emperor's place, and his hatred for his imagined torturers grew until he came up with his own death plan. How about I take some of them with me, he had offered. It will be my penance for unleashing the beast Dalziel upon those women. It took a week to devise the exploding coffin concept, a plan which left a malicious grin on Avery's face. Now, Garin had to shield his face from the full effect of Henry Avery's revenge. He heard footsteps before he could see anything. Over here, he called out to the approaching figures. Jimmy Duke chuckled as he bolted past him. Garin grabbed Pharaoh by the fabric of his shirt and began running down the dark street away from the chaos. 2 blocks passed it by in seconds. Naroban and a group of 20 Hindu men and children flowed out from the evening shadows. Follow me, Captain, Bond said to the crowd. The rest of you do your part. Their part, an insurgency of chaos, quickly followed as teams of 4 to 5 spread into different streets, setting trash on fire and drawing attention to themselves with shouts of anarchy and protest. It had been a month since Garin had seen his sailing master after leaving Bond in the city of Bombay with 2 purposes, to find a route and to create another diversion. For 200 years, the Mughal emperors had waged war upon the subcontinent of India, bringing one small kingdom after another into the empire. But oppression had followed, and with it Sharia law followed the Islamic emperors, leaving behind a large population of Hindu followers desperate and willing to follow a radical voice like Bond. Plus, a little of the Captain Kidd loot helped make friends. With each stride Garin took, running from one side of the peninsula to the other, chaos and riots followed behind him. Having studied the map of Bombay for months, he could picture the scene already. The troops back at the destroyed mosque, those meant to kill or capture Duke, were now tasked with sorting through the rubble for answer. Even if a quick-witted sergeant spotted Duke and Pharaoh running from the mosque, disguised as soldiers, his men had a lead in the foot race. The southern island created the western side of the large bay was only a few miles wide, so as the Imperial Navy used the British fort and its hidden ships to serve as a net, open water of the Indian Ocean was on the other unguarded side of the island. Young Hindu boys joined the four men as they ran, taking them through a maze of streets and alleys. All the while they ran, Garin felt the streets begin to slope downhill to the western shore, to freedom. Chapter 72, Aboard the White Zombie, 1707. Captain Charlie Johnson, formerly first mate, formerly the Bear Man, Paul Bonjean, and Pierre Charles Le Sueur, stood in the darkness of night facing the east toward India. Dawn comes. Where are you, Garin? The divided crew didn't sleep either as they waited to find out the fate of their bold captain. There were so many things that could have gone wrong, Le Sueur decided, but Garin insisted their plan was the only path forward. The deck boards creaked under his weight as he paced from one end of the railing to the other. After his encounter with Blackbeard's men, Le Sueur fully believed what Garin told him privately. The substance being taken from the mountain stronghold and placed upon Blackbeard's transportation wagons was shamir, something few in the world knew existed, according to Garin. The dangerous substance had once been a successful failure, an unintended mistake from its creator, and instead of being destroyed, it was kept hidden in storage. When the container broke open, it didn't explode in a flash like gunpowder. Instead, it rose from the ground like vapor, and like an entranced cobra being led by the music of an invisible flute, the strange vapor flowed against the law of physics, and then began to feast on any flesh or substance in its way. How am I even alive? Le Sueur looked down at his hands, remembering a similar heat he had encountered back in a deep pit at Makato. Perhaps Winona was right. If I am the Wishwe, then I need to get back to the frontier to save her people. "A ship," said one of the men on the crow's nest, called out in a muffled tone, "heading right towards us." The entire crew shifted nervously in their position. To be sailing at night, so close to land, it would either be an Imperial patrol or, keeping his own voice harnessed as he gave out instructions to the crew, he remembered the words of Jimmy Duke, "Don't let anyone else touch my anchor." Master Horn's cannons were loaded, even though he wasn't on the ship to give his powder monkeys commands. If it was an Imperial patrol, they would fire all their guns and then return back to Kiltan Island to wait. "It's the Starling," another crewman shouted out. "It could be a trap," the Sueur reminded them. "Wait for the signal." After taking command of the Starling, Garin and his team took the ambassador's coffin, staff, and Long Ben Avery to a minor port on the north island of Bombay, where the Dutch ship anchored anonymously with its cargo of cinnamon. If the prisoner exchange happened, Garin and Professor Pharaoh would escape away from the mosque to the western shore, to be ferried back to the Starling. Any attempts to spot the former Quedagh merchant would prove futile, since Le Sueur anchored miles away. If Garin was tortured and captured, Imperial troops could be on the Starling right now, his pessimism argued. No, his optimism countered, Garin wouldn't give us up. Even so, Le Sueur worried for his friend. Without Garin, everything would fall apart. Le Sueur wondered where he would even go. Pierre Charles Le Sueur was dead, after all, and had only an unfaithful wife waiting in the New World, more likely than not already married to another. Without Garin, there'd be no reason to return to Winona either, and the dark secrets hidden in the land of the Blue Woman would stay buried. Lanterns illuminated the deck of the Starling. Hats began to wave, including the large hat of Captain Legrand. Thank God he's alive. The Starling didn't even wait for the white zombie, blowing by it as cheers erupted on both sides. The anchor was raised, the sails were dropped, and both ships chased the darkness west into the vast space of the Indian Ocean. Perhaps I'll still be able to see Winona again, after all. Chapter 73, La Mobile, Alabama, 1707. At 31, Marguerite LeSueur remained the most beautiful and wealthiest woman in the Alabama colony, whose cemetery outpaced the growth of its residents. A year after she'd sent a letter to Montreal asking for help, a large merchant ship finally arrived with an answer. Her 4 children ran down to the hill to the docks, along with all the other colonists, but she took her time in the mirror preparing her makeup and hair. I must be the Queen of La Mobile, even if my title has been taken away. She lived in a sturdy but simple 2-story wooden home built on a hill that overlooked the colony and fort. Like the other 80 single-story homes along the banks of the Mobile River, her home was freshly painted. It had been built out of courtesy, despite the fact that her husband had died while she was traveling south from Montreal. Her hired servants, Francois Bonneau, Julien Choquet, and Antoine Fossey, helped build the house out of pity, for they knew she had also lost a daughter and brother on the trip down the Mississippi River. Once the largest home in the colony was built, all 3 servants, having fulfilled their contracts, returned back to Montreal. For 2 years, she lived at the mercy of the other colonists and Commissary Nicolas de La Salle. Marguerite turned from her mirror, and out of the window, she saw the tall sails of the big ship that had arrived that morning. Stepping outside her home, she noticed a swarm of canoes and small sailing vessels surrounding the anchored ship. All in all, almost 300 figures lingered along the long boardwalk that led from the base of the hill and over the marshy bank. A young slave girl came running up to the hill to her house. "Your cousin is on the ship." "Oh, thank God, thank God." Marguerite straightened her back and held her head high. "Tell my cousin he can find me in the cemetery." She turned her back on the river and walked up the street that led to the cemetery to be with the dead. Although the Pelican left La Rochelle with dozens of eligible young women, only 23 reached La Mobile alive. Marguerite walked through the rows of dead dreams. She stopped in front of the marker for the colony's founder, Pierre Le Moyne Sieur d'Iberville, her cousin, who died the previous summer in Cuba. She vividly remembered when her mother Anne brought her to visit Uncle Charles and the dozen cousins that filled his mansion. For a brief moment in time, the Le Moyne family had positioned itself to become the monarchs of New France, and Princess Marguerite would rule the Louisiana colony with her ambitious husband, Pierre Charles LeSueur. War with England changed everything, and now 9 of the 12 Le Moyne cousins were dead. So were her dreams of being a queen. The slave girl came running across the spongy ground to stop in the shadow of the tall grave marker. "Your cousin is coming to see you. Do you need anything?" The little orphan girl had been brought back after a recent battle with a tribe up the Mississippi River. Marguerite understood her melancholy. While bringing life-saving supplies, the big merchant ship likely carried disease as well. "Find the children and have them go back to the house." Her children with Pierre Charles would soon begin flying the nest. Marianne was 14, Mary 11, Margaret 8, and her son and heir, Jean-Paul, was 10, yet looked like a full-grown man. If Louise had lived, she would have been 13 in the summer. Marguerite looked up from her feigned prayers when she heard footsteps reach the soft ground of the cemetery. The shocking sight caused her broken heart to tear in half. One face and figure it recognized immediately, Nicolas Chauvin. The brash Montreal soldier had once served her husband in the Battle of Quebec, and despite having married a local native woman, he acted as a surrogate husband the past 2 years. The other 2 figures were phantoms of dead men. The ghost of Pierre Charles LeSueur towered above the other men just as he'd done in life. Marguerite clutched her chest and tried to find her balance, with her other hand grasping the grass. The long black beard and broad shoulders looked the same from a distance, but with each step the giant shrunk a little, until it became painfully obvious that the stranger was not her husband. But the other phantom only regained reality with each step he took, and soon the face of one of her dead cousins, Joseph Lemoyne, smiled at her. "Marguerite?" She tried to rise to her feet, but stumbled awkwardly, prompting him to rush forward to pick her up from under her arms and to lift her into the air before crushing her in his strong embrace. "We thought you had died at sea," she said through her tears and laughter. "I thought I had died also," Joseph Lemoyne added. 8 years her senior, his face was weathered and scarred at the cheek, his hair gray and thin, yet his arms and stature were still strong. He glanced at the vacant grave of his elder brother Pierre, and then sat her down. "I've returned to help set things right again." She stepped back, still clutching her chest, and nodded for him to explain. "This is my friend and companion, Captain Edward Drummond, a loyal servant and son of the morning," Joseph Lemoyne added. Captain Drummond extended a hand to hers, which he kissed as he bowed. "Perhaps I won't have to settle on marrying Mr. Chauvin." "Captain Drummond and I spent the winter raiding English settlements in the Caribbean, and along with money and supplies, we've also brought back Jean-Baptiste, who will be establishing a new colony more suited to such a beauty as yourself." Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, 27, had been unceremoniously sent out as a scout following the departure of colony founder Pierre Lemoyne in 1702. "It is so good to see you," Marguerite said, throwing her arms around her cousin for a second hug. Behind them, standing at the boardwalk, she saw the slave girl, her 4 children, and her servant, Charles Potier, who'd been sent back to Montreal a year ago to sell her house and 2 properties that would have gone to either Pierre-Charles Lesueur or her brother, Michael Messier. Instead, Mr. Potier likely carried a chest of money. Marguerite shed tears of joy. My prayers have finally been answered. Chapter 74. Kiltan Island, 1707. With the 2 ships anchored off the shore of Kiltan Island, Louis Armand Guerin stood at the railing of the Starling and quickly shook hands with the freed Dutch officers as they returned to their ship. On the shore of Kiltan Island, the marooned Dutch crew watched the whole ordeal. In the water, a crewman from the White Zombie held onto the rowboat floating beside the ship. "I certainly wish we could have met under better circumstances," Guerin said, repeating the sentiment he'd told them a dozen times in recent days. "I wish all of you safe travels." The island of Kiltan stretched only 2 miles north to south and was only a third of a mile wide. Formed by a coral reef, it had just enough tree growth to shelter marooned soldiers. Located over 400 miles south of Bombay and 150 miles off the coast of India, it served as the final stage of the Henry Avery plot. Guerin turned, seeing the White Zombie anchored 50 yards away, with Lesueur standing at the railing and a rowboat at its side. There had been whispers from the true pirates in his crew of keeping the Starling and abandoning all the Dutchmen. But Guerin, despite all the roles he had to play, wanted to be a man of honor, a man who'd make his mother proud. He'd been born a bastard and had no memory of his mother, Jean Guerin. The servants in his father's household now told him how Isaac Delorme, the Baron of Lahoughton, had dearly loved Jeannie, but their relationship was consummated out of wedlock, when Louis Armand was born outside the bonds of holy matrimony. The only heir of Lahoughton remained illegitimate for the first few months. His mother Jeannie died shortly after his birth, and he was raised by a wet nurse until his father married Françoise de la Flache de Cotes, who became the only mother he could remember. With his foster mother's loving consent, he was baptized at the age of 3, turning him from bastard to heir of Lahatan. Religious protocols had kept his parents from marrying, and the shadow of his mother's devout legacy fueled his own religious studies. Despite a bitterness toward the Catholic Church, he grew up devout, even if his studies went deep into the history of the Church. By the time he was a young man, the heir with a servant's humility went to Rome for more than just training. He went looking for answers. Hidden in Rome, he found the periphery, and when the priests and agents of the organization that existed prior to the founding of Rome discovered his talents, he became an acolyte. When his father died, he was called back to France to play the part of Louis Armand de Lame d'Arcy, Baron of Lahatan. Louis Armand had already sworn his life to the periphery. Now, as his mother's son, he was on the verge of unlocking an ancient mystery. The son of Jeannie Guerin climbed up the rope ladder and into the rowboat. The crewman held the boat steady, and once he took hold of the oars, he turned back to his ship. Across the way, Captain Adrian Van Brock rowed back to reclaim his crew and ship. When the two rowboats met in the waters between the ships, they paused for a moment. "I see you have the promised treasure," Guerin said. "What will you do with your share?" "Captain Kidd's blood money? I haven't decided how to spend it, but you've effectively destroyed my life by using my ship in this ruse." "The name of Adrian Van Brock has been stolen from me." "Yes, but you're still alive. If you ever use your name again, the Emperor's men will find, torture, and kill you to learn more about me. Whatever you do, don't make port until you're 1,000 miles away from India. Start again in the New World. You're Dutch. You'll find a home in Montreal or New York. Take a new name or start a family. Or sail to the Caribbean, build a shack, and drink away your small fortune. Just not as Captain Van Brock. That name belongs to me." Van Brock laughed. "I suppose I must first gather my stranded crew. I have been a man of my word, and your crew has certainly been loyal to their word. Has my first mate treated you well during your time on the White Zombie?" "He has. The crew thinks he is a demigod. From the tales I've heard, I almost wish to join you on your new adventures. Where will you go now?" "A lot depends on Professor Farrow." "I'm riding the Maelstrom, and it is hard to say where it will take me. I only hope the Lord has further need of me and will forgive me my sins. I have left a new manuscript in your cabin. If you manage to find a way to bring it to the address of the publishing house in Amsterdam, another small fortune, one that you will not have to share with your crew, will be given to you." "A manuscript?" "A false narrative about the life of Henry Avery. Some of it is true, other details have been embellished. Men like Emperor Aurangzeb often determine fact and fiction, and this account, written in your name, will further muddy the water about what transpired at Madagascar." "You stick a dagger in a man and then apologize for killing him." Van Broek shook his head dismissively. "Fate put you on my path, and I've done what I can to rectify it. Publish the manuscript, and you'll be able to start a new life." Van Broek laughed again. "You are a vile and amazing man." He began rowing back to his ship. "I look forward to reading about Long Ben Avery," Guerin shouted as they faced each other with their backs to their respective ships. "I only wish I was writing about the exploits of Captain Legrand," Van Broek said. "Good luck, Legrand." The crew of the White Zombie began to cheer for their captain's return, bringing a wry smile to Guerin's face. "Guerin, I am from this forth Guerin." When the nose of the rowboat struck the side of the White Zombie, Guerin slumped down in exhaustion. Chapter 75, Fort Maurepas, Alabama, 1707. Edward Drummond heard all he needed to know. We're at war with the third enemy. He emptied his cup, set it down upon the table with a long sigh, and then pushed himself away from the table. He dined with Eos men at the abandoned fort, built first to aid in Lesueur's expedition up the Mississippi River to search for the Philosopher's Stone. After he returned with it, the location was abandoned in favor of a more secure Fort Mobile. "You're not leaving tonight, are you?" Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne asked. Apparently, he lost the trust of the local colonists following the death of their older brother, the Sieur d'Iberville, Pierre Lemoyne. While almost the same age as the 27-year-old Drummond, he'd lived the soft life of an aristocrat. "Here on land," Drummond began as he rose from his place at the officer's table, "time moves slower than it does out on the ocean. Our enemy is not the Priory of Ormus, the Periphery, or even the Jesuits. It certainly is not the Spanish, the Natchez, or diseased creatures of these swamps. We are in a race against time." He picked up his hat, his cutlass, and his thick leather belt that had 4 pistols strapped to it. "We could use you here," Joseph Lemoyne added as Drummond secured his weapons. The officer's table was filled with men who served Eos. He looked to the rogue who'd once served Baron Lahoughton on the frontier. "Gather as much wealth from the Caribbean as you can in the coming days. The war in the northern colonies has stalled, and we have good men like Etienne Delhut and your brother Charles there to protect the interests of France and the Order of Eos. Here in the swamps, we are weak. The traitor Lesueur has already proven how feeble the Eos leadership is down here in the Gulf. 2 weeks in Alabama taught him all he needed to know about the monstrous man that almost took his life back in Madagascar. Even though the widow and the Lemoynes insisted Pierre Charles Lesueur had died in Cuba, Drummond now had a name for the face that had come out of the jungle. With Baron Lahoughton vanishing onto a pirate ship near Oak Island, Drummond finally understood what went so wrong. Eos had only been focusing on the Priory of Ormus. The men who ambushed him certainly belonged to the Periphery, the ancient enemy that existed in the shadows. "Where will you go?" Nicolas Chauvin asked. The fools in Montreal had almost set up Pierre Charles Lesueur as the leader of the Louisiana colony, only to be discovered by chance by Bartolomé St. Clair, who exposed Lesueur's connections to the theft of the prized Aberon map. Charles Lemoyne selected a loyal Eos man, Chauvin, to accompany his niece to the southern colony. "Apparently, I have an empire to build before I crown myself. I'm sailing back to Scotland. First, I'll visit the Sinclairs and return the Odin Stone to them. Then I'll pay a visit to my ancestral home and make sure the Almaric map remains in safekeeping." "Won't you imperil yourself by getting so close to England?" "The Priory has its hands full with the war," Drummond said. "Morrison managed to cripple their attempts at building a fleet, so we need to be quick before they regroup. Our forefathers underestimated both England and the Priory. We will not do the same." "When will you return?" Antoine Lemoyne, the youngest of the 3 brothers in Louisiana, asked him as he began to walk away. "As soon as the sea allows," Drummond said earnestly. "I mean to search the ruins of your brother's sunken ship. If the Philosopher's Stone is indeed beneath the waters of Bermuda, it will be found. Although we now know Lesueur to be a liar, don't we?" The 3 Lemoynes, who'd once worshipped the man, nodded. "It is not a coincidence that there is an organized resistance up the Mississippi River," Drummond finished. "The Natchez?" Jean-Baptiste asked. "While I am away, root them out. I would suspect agents of the Periphery are supplying them with the resources needed. Chauvin, you need to press them hard, make alliances with other tribes and overwhelm them. While preying upon the Spanish and British colonies in the Caribbean," he said to his other seafaring brothers, "keep an eye on the mouth of the Mississippi. I suspect the Natchez are being aided by outside agents." For saving his life and preserving the Order of Eos, Grandmaster Marco Alvarez had promised him a great reward. Soon, the Order of Eos will be mine to control. The Alchemist's Ring, Chapter 76. Socotra Island, 1707. Professor Josiah Farrow woke that day a free man for the first time in over a decade. No more shackles, no more cells, no more guards. The island of Socotra could be seen in the glow of the rising sun. At any time, he could hop into the dinghies transferring supplies or even jump into the water and swim to the sandy shore. As promised, Louis Armand Guerin had taken him to neutral waters. Socotra was situated in a shipping lane between the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the nearby Persian Gulf. Countless nations sailed the waters, allowing him to find a port of his choosing. Captain Guerin had also given him an ultimatum, and he expected a decision to be made by the time they crossed from Kiltan Island to Socotra Island. Where do I go from here? He chose to walk up to the captain's quarters. 3 men stopped eating their breakfast when he appeared in the doorway. Guerin gestured to the empty chair beside Pierre-Charles Lesueur. Opposite of them, the Abyssinian, Benjamin Horn, watched him with wide eyes. "I'm glad you've decided to join us for breakfast," Guerin said as he finished his last bite. "I really didn't want to see Charlie have to slice up your genitals and get the answers we wanted." Guerin laughed, but Lesueur didn't. A harrowing sign. Is he being serious? "I want to be part of this investigation." The word made Guerin smile and lift his eyebrows. "Very well. No torture, no murder, just an alliance of minds. As you know, we went through quite a great deal to acquire you. We could have returned to America with our heads held high, knowing that we'd foiled the plans of our enemies. But that's not what I was put on this earth to do." "You were put on this earth to torment me," Lesueur said. "I've made promises to these 2 men, important promises. The 4 of us, however, all seem to be given different pieces of the same puzzle. I believe the Lord brought us together to solve a great mystery. Let me begin with my piece of the puzzle." Guerin wiped off his mouth and pushed away his plate. "I'm an advanced scout for the Periphery. It's a religious organization of sorts, established long before the Catholic Church took root in Rome. We are wardens of humanity. We fight against the darkness, which means we protect the Lord's people, great and small, from evil men like those in the Priory and Eos. We don't evangelize. We don't preach." Lesueur cleared his throat. Guerin ignored it. "We protect. I was trained as an advanced scout. Rumors reached the Periphery that both the Jesuit order and the Order of Eos were fixated on rumors of an ancient relic out on the frontier. The Philosopher's Stone. Then my carvings in the brig certainly drew his attention, Farrow decided. "Yes, I supplied plenty of books on alchemy to buyers from Montreal." "That was me," Lesueur muttered, and continued working on his plate of food. "And here we sit together years later." "I fulfilled my mission prerogative by thwarting the interests of my enemies and confirming the resting place of the Philosopher's Stone." "He found it?" "But long before I could return home, I ended up being swept up by pirates. Like yourself, I was driven by curiosity and followed the clues to where they led, a secret colony of Templar refugees." "Your turn, Charlie," Guerin concluded. Lesueur cleared his throat twice. "I didn't have a choice in the matter. Fate just took a massive shit on my life. When I was a kid, my family sent me to New France to make a name for myself. At first, I worked for the Jesuits as a linguist. I learned the languages of the local tribes and helped the priests in all manner of communications. The most gifted and brilliant of the priests I worked with was Father Marquette. At first, it appeared he'd simply been tasked with exploration, but at the end, he revealed his real purpose. He'd been given an ancient map that purportedly described the location of the Philosopher's Stone. Because of his efforts, the Order of Eos poisoned him. I kept the map. Apparently, Garin added when Lesueur withdrew emotionally, the map once belonged to the Priory of Ormus, was stolen a century ago by the Jesuits, and now is in the hands of Eos. But not before Charlie made a mess of things. Tell the professor what happened. I led a secret mining expedition into the frontier, dug it up, but lost everything when the ship carrying it sank off the coast of Bermuda. When I returned to France, instead of punishing me for my private and public failures, they chose to reward me with a new colony on condition of returning to the land of the Blue Woman. Pharaoh chuckled knowingly. Blue Woman, vitriol, Undine. It all connects. He grew self-conscious of his misunderstood reaction, so he refocused. They sent you back? Garin pointed a finger at him and grinned. Ah, you're beginning to see the larger mystery also. What else is out on the frontier? Luckily, Mr. Horn came into my life around the same time I found your coded distress message. Tell Professor Pharaoh about your piece of the puzzle. Like Louis Armand Garin, I was sent out into the world by a religious order with ancient roots. The Order of Eos has been our enemy since the days of the dawn, but in recent centuries it tried to steal the knowledge we've long protected. When I found your marking inside of the brig of this ship, then the Queda merchant, I believed you were the thief who stole our holy relic. Me? I've never stolen a thing in my life, Pharaoh insisted. Benjamin Horn nodded. I know that it was Eos, but once we filtered through the lies surrounding the Ganji Sawai incident, Louis Armand and I understood why Eos fixated on the legends of King Solomon. The Aberon map that Lesueur witnessed was created by an Abyssinian mapmaker and navigator employed by the Queen of Sheba. She gave him to King Solomon's expedition to find the Philosopher's Stone on the Lost Continent. Although the expedition failed to bring back the Philosopher's Stone, it nevertheless created a map that led back to Lesueur's land of the Blue Woman. Lesueur rose, walked over to the lock cabinet, and produced a lead canister that he had set on the table. The Shamir of King Solomon. Louis Armand waited for him to sit down. When the Order of Eos called themselves the Templar Knights, it discovered a cache of Solomon's attempt at replicating the Philosopher's Stone. This same material devoured much of the mountain months ago back on Madagascar. Some of it still exists thanks to Lesueur's rival, Blackbeard. This canister remained unopened and, for now, a dead end. Besides raiding the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem, the Templar Knights briefly invaded Benjamin's homeland. Tell them what you seek, Master Horn. Do you know what we keep in the sacred churches of Abyssinia? Horn instead chose to quiz him. Pharaoh nodded. If the tales are true, Queen Makeda made 11 replicas of the Ark of the Covenant, and 12 sacred churches kept them, with only a secret order of priests who knew which one was the true Ark. Louis Armand clasped his hands. You are indeed the right man. Regardless of which Ark was taken by Eos, I knew there were 3 locations it might be kept. It was not on Madeira, and it turns out it was not on Madagascar either, which leads me to a final destination. After all our time together, Master Horn and I are in agreement with what we need to do next. But before we do it, we'll be visiting Abyssinia to collect a necessary relic, especially after Lesueur dropped the key into the Atlantic. Of course, you know what we're going after in the ancient kingdom of Sheba, don't you? Pharaoh nodded. Had they not fallen into Emperor Rangzeb's trap, He and Thomas would have scoured the ancient lands for a mysterious relic that could command demons to do its bidding. Ketam Suluman, King Solomon's ring, the Seal of Solomon, the two unlocking triangles in alchemy, known commonly as the Star of David, was the central etching upon the mysterious ring. "Now it's your turn," Garen said. "Tell us what piece of the puzzle you possess." Like Daniel in the lion's den, Josiah Pharaoh had prayed earnestly to God for delivery from his enemies. After passing from Eos to the emperor, his prayers seemed to finally be answered. In creating the Seal of Solomon and the Shamir, King Solomon researched an ancient legend involving the sorcerer who created the stone. What piece of the puzzle do I have? Thomas, too, knew I was working on the ancient language used during that time. Solomon engraved what he knew of it upon his ring. The Arabian sarcophagus, lusted after by two and the emperor, held phrases of that language still upon it. To command the evil spirits within either the Shamir or the stone, the ancient words needed to be uttered. So will you come with us to help us unlock these great mysteries? You now understand our rivals and enemies. We can leave you behind on Socotra, or you can come with us on the next leg of your great adventure. He'd probably kill me rather than risk me falling into the wrong hands again. I'll come with you willingly. Wonderful, Garen said, and then loudly clapped his hands together to say, "Open sesame." Pharaoh grinned. When the time arises, you might want to say abracadabra instead. Chapter 77, London, England, 1707. 4,000 miles from Kiltan Island, Catherine Barton sat in her private box at the Queen's Theatres. As the mistress of the Earl of Halifax, she was quite used to whispers. As a regal beauty since her teens, she was used to lustful eyes watching her. As the niece of Sir Isaac Newton, she understood his lessons in alchemy on how to transform fame into power. As a new leader within the Priory of Ormus, she took her social status to a whole new level. The comedy was well into the second act when a handsome gentleman entered the box from the rear and sat down beside her. "Miss Martin," he whispered softly. She extended her gloved hand, which he accepted and kissed lightly. Not yet 30, she wore a velvet gown that showed plenty of cleavage. "Sit, Governor Rogers. We have much to discuss." Rogers lightly chuckled at her playful use of the title governor and sat down meekly beside her. "You tease, Miss Martin." "Oh, do I?" she said gaily. "This play has put me in better spirits, I suppose, after hearing so many bad reports in recent weeks. I hear you are a companion of bad news also. Your father died recently?" "Several months ago," he said and cleared his throat. "That is correct." "He knows who I am, and he certainly knows my uncle. Which leaves you a grieving yet wealthy man. I forget, is your name spelled with or without the E?" "My father was Woods, and I am Woods Rogers with an E." "Then our paperwork is all in order," Catherine Barton said, handing him the portfolio. "Our offer is summarized on the top sheet. Take a moment to review it." Even though Woods Rogers was a handsome, robust gentleman, he was only a new pawn in the game, and thus held no interest for Catherine. Even so, she dressed as if she planned on seducing him away from his young bride. With the death of his father in Madagascar debacle, young Woods inherited a shipping business, making him a formidable ally. She ignored him as he read, and after the proper amount of time, she began talking. "Did you hear that the director of this play died a few weeks ago? Is it morbid that audiences pack the theater?" "Not at all," he answered, his forehead wrinkled. He kept his eyes upon the stage as she studied him. "If anything, it immortalizes him after his death." "Perhaps he has the makings of a knight or a rook instead of just a pawn." Woods looked strong and sophisticated. "My uncle makes plans for his work to continue after his death, so in that matter, Mr. Farquhar, The playwright has attained a small measure of immortality. I doubt his play will be remembered as long as my uncle. It's titled The Beau's Stratagem. What do you say, Mr. Rogers? Will you be our beau? It's shocking, to be honest with you, but I have recently agreed to accompany Captain William Dampier on a 2-ship expedition to the Pacific. If only this offer had been made a few... Yes, and it's the reason why we chose you. We want you to go on your 3-year circumnavigation of the world, but we want you to be our eyes and ears. My uncle has had his pride wounded, and I've tempered his wrath for the time being. You've lost a father, and have no recourse for your grief or wrath either. When you return in 3 years, we will unleash you on our shared enemies. We will fund your every need. You will be a bane to these pirates who sail the 7 seas, the ones who killed your father. If you punish your uncle's enemies, I will greet you earnestly with the title of governor. Read through the rest of the proposal, but at the end of this play, I want an answer. You won't have to wait until the end of the play, Miss Barton. Give me the names of the men who killed my father. Where shall I begin?